You know that moment when someone older tells you something like, just work hard and everything will eventually fall into place, and instead of feeling reassured, you feel a quiet pause inside your mind, not because the advice sounds wrong, and not because you think they're out of touch, but because something about it feels slightly disconnected from the reality you experience every day. It's a strange feeling. You respect the wisdom behind the words, yet at the same time, a small part of you wonders whether the world they're describing is the same world you're navigating right now. For years, people have explained this as a simple generation gap. Millennials think one way, Gen X thinks another, but when psychologists began looking more closely at these patterns, they noticed something deeper happening beneath the surface. What makes this topic fascinating is that generational differences usually aren't about personality. They're about the psychological environments people grow up in. Every generation absorbs a slightly different set of messages about how life works. Those messages don't always appear in obvious ways. They show up in the stories adults tell, the economic conditions people witness growing up, the expectations teachers emphasize, and the cultural conversations that surround success and adulthood. Over time, these influences quietly shape what psychologists sometimes call your mental model of reality. It's the internal map your mind uses to predict how effort, opportunity, and stability should behave in the world. Once that mental model forms, it becomes surprisingly powerful. It influences how you interpret setbacks, how you define success, and even how you judge your own progress through life. That's why two generations can experience the same event, like job instability or economic change, and come away with completely different emotional reactions. They're not just responding to the situation itself, they're responding to how that situation fits into the expectations their minds developed years earlier. If you look at many people from Generation X, their early environment often emphasized independence and self-reliance. A lot of Gen X grew up during a time when both parents were working, and children were expected to become comfortable managing their time on their own. In fact, this generation was sometimes referred to as the latchkey generation, because many kids returned home from school to empty houses and had to figure things out independently. That experience shaped a particular psychological orientation. When you grow up learning to solve problems by yourself, your mind gradually becomes comfortable with uncertainty. Instead of expecting systems to provide stability, you develop the habit of adapting when circumstances change. At the same time, Gen X witnessed economic shifts that reinforced this mindset. Companies downsized, entire industries transformed. The idea that a single job could provide lifelong security slowly started to fade. So the psychological strategy that emerged for many people in that generation was relatively straightforward. Rely on yourself, stay flexible, and don't assume that stability will always be guaranteed by institutions. Over time, this created a worldview that values resilience, independence, and practicality. Life might be unpredictable, but if you stay adaptable, you'll find a way forward. But millennials, however, grew up hearing a somewhat different cultural messaging. Throughout schools, media, and even parenting styles, millennials were often encouraged to pursue possibility and personal fulfillment. They were told to follow their passion, to discover work that feels meaningful, and to build a life that reflects who they truly are. In many ways, this message was incredibly empowering. It expanded the definition of success beyond simple survival or financial stability. It suggested that a career could be more than just a job. It could be an extension of identity. But this shift in cultural messaging also introduced a subtle psychological pressure. When work becomes tied to purpose and identity, the stakes of career decisions become much higher. It's no longer just about earning a living, it's about discovering the right path, the one that feels authentic and meaningful. And when that path doesn't appear clearly, or when the world becomes economically unstable, the uncertainty can feel deeply personal. Instead of simply adapting to a difficult situation, millennials might find themselves questioning whether they're somehow failing to find the life they were encouraged to pursue. This difference in expectation becomes especially noticeable when both generations encounter the same challenge. Imagine two people facing an unstable job market. Someone from Gen X might see the situation and think, well, this is how life works sometimes. Time to adjust and figure out the next move. Their mindset has already prepared them for unpredictability. But a millennial might experience the same situation and feel a deeper layer of anxiety, not just about stability, but about identity and direction. If success is supposed to come from finding meaningful work, then uncertainty can feel like evidence that something about the path itself might be wrong. Neither reaction is irrational. Each one reflects the psychological environment that shaped the person experiencing it. But when these different interpretations meet in everyday conversations, misunderstandings can easily appear. A Gen X manager might see a millennial employee seeking purpose and think they're overanalyzing something that simply requires patience and persistence. Meanwhile, the millennial might see Gen X's practical approach and wonder how someone could stay in a situation that doesn't seem personally fulfilling. What's happening in these moments isn't really a disagreement about effort or responsibility. It's a clash between two different mental models of how life is supposed to unfold. One model emphasizes resilience and adaptation, the other emphasizes meaning and alignment. Both approaches have strengths, both can lead to fulfilling lives, but because they're based on different expectations, they sometimes interpret the same experiences in completely different ways. Psychologists who study generational patterns often describe this as a form of cultural conditioning. Every generation grows up solving the problems of its time. Those solutions then become habits of thinking that carry into adulthood. For Gen X, the challenge was learning to navigate uncertainty without relying too heavily on institutions. For millennials, the challenge became learning how to pursue fulfillment in a world that promised possibility, but often delivered complexity. Interestingly, these differences don't only appear in discussions about careers, they also show up in conversations about work-life balance, ambition, and even personal identity. Gen X often prioritizes independence and practicality. Millennials tend to prioritize purpose and emotional alignment. One generation might ask, is this stable enough to build a life around? While the other asks, does this reflect who I truly want to be? These questions can lead to different choices, but they're both attempts to solve the same underlying problem: how to build a meaningful life in an unpredictable world. Another layer of this conversation involves how each generation relates to institutions and authority. Gen X developed a certain level of skepticism towards large systems because they watched those systems change dramatically during their formative years. Millennials, on the other hand, were often raised with the expectation that institutions like education and career structures could help them unlock opportunity. When those systems later failed to deliver the stability many expected, it created a sense of confusion and reevaluation. This doesn't mean one generation is more resilient or more idealistic than the other. It simply means their minds were shaped by different environments. The human brain is incredibly adaptive. It learns from the patterns it observes growing up. If the world around you emphasizes independence, you develop independence. If the world emphasizes possibility and self-expression, you develop a strong focus on meaning and identity. Once you begin to see generational psychology through this lens, many of the debates between millennials and Gen X start to feel less like arguments and more like conversations between people who learned slightly different survival strategies. One strategy says, adapt and keep moving forward. The other says, search for the path that truly fits. Both are responses to real conditions that existed at different points in time. Understanding this can shift the way you interpret generational differences. Instead of assuming someone else's perspective is misguided, you start to see how their experiences shaped the expectations they carry. The advice someone gives you often reflects the world they learned to navigate, not necessarily the world that exists today. And the frustration you feel about that advice might come from realizing that your own environment taught you to expect something slightly different. In the end, generational psychology isn't really about deciding which mindset is correct. It's about recognizing how adaptable the human mind truly is. Every generation learns from the conditions around it and builds strategies that seem reasonable within that context. Those strategies then become part of how people interpret success, effort, and even personal identity. So if you ever find yourself in a conversation where someone from another generation sees life in a completely different way, it might help to pause for a moment. Their perspective may not simply be opinion, it might be the result of a completely different psychological environment shaping how they understand the world. And once you recognize that pattern, something interesting happens. The conversation becomes less about proving who is right and more about understanding how different experiences create different ways of seeing the same reality. Sometimes that realization alone can change how we listen to each other. Because once you see the pattern behind generational thinking, you start noticing it everywhere. In conversations about work, in debates about ambition, and even in the quiet expectations people carry about what a meaningful life is supposed to look like. And if this perspective made you reflect on your own experiences, consider subscribing to the channel. This space is for exploring the hidden patterns behind human behavior, the quiet psychology that shapes how we think, relate, and make sense of the world. If you enjoy thoughtful conversations about the mind and the subtle forces that influence our lives, subscribing helps this channel continue sharing ideas that encourage deeper understanding.